Okay, folks, so the next thing that we're going to be looking at this week is Jesus' response to the Canaanite woman, the Syrophoenician woman, and what happens in that interaction. We're going to think about that in light of a conversation around or consideration of prejudice and discrimination. I want to begin then with a quote from James Baldwin. It goes a little something like this. I imagine one of the reasons people cling to their hate so stubbornly is because they sense that once hate is gone, they'll be forced to deal with pain. And I would include in that fear. Again, I imagine one of the reasons that people cling to their hate so stubbornly is because they sense once hate is gone, they'll be forced to deal with pain and fear. Right? So I want you to think about then in your own life, are there people that you would say you detest, that you maybe even hate, that you would even use that word hate? And why is that? Right? According to James Baldwin, what's underneath that is pain. And I would piggyback on what James Baldwin is saying, the great civil rights activist, and say that it's also fear. Right? Fear of the unknown, that's xenophobia, fear of what we can't control, right? Often when we don't have enough information about a group of people or something, it leads us to make assumptions about it or to just believe what we've heard, right? And so as we talked about throughout this semester, it's really important that we get as much information as possible and have as many encounters with different ideas and different people so that we can form our own opinions and actually even begin to develop relationships with people that maybe are very different from us, right? And what we see in the reading for today about Jesus' interaction with the Canaanite woman is his encounter with someone who the Jewish people traditionally look down on, much like they look down on Samaritans, right? So let's read then also, or I will read, and you can read along on the PowerPoint, the words of Jesus in Matthew 7. He says, "Do not judge so that you may not be judged. For with the judgment you make, you will be judged, and the measure you give will be the measure that you get," right? Which seems like a karmic equation, right? "Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but you don't notice the log in your own eye," right? Our capacity to see and critique others and not be self-critical. "How can you say to your neighbor, 'Let me take that speck out of your eye,' while there's a log in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye." Powerful, right? I mean, just take a moment to think about the ways in which we're so ready to attack and critique others, and yet when we're critiqued, we want to defend, right? And the other thing is, how many of us are confident enough or comfortable enough with who we are to be self-critical, right? To think about, why do I hate this person so much, or why am I so afraid of this? What's really going on there, right? It takes a lot of courage to go deeper. So if we were in class, then what I would have you do is we'd talk through this next slide. As I state these roles, these jobs, these occupations, I want you to consider who you see filling them, right? So when I say CEO, who do you think of? When I say president, who do you think of? When I say minister, who do you think of? When I say teacher, now who comes to mind? What about if I were to say housekeeper or custodian? Who comes to mind? If I say athlete, who do you think of first? So what I want you to do now is I want you to actually type these things into your search engine. I mean, really, to do this. And see, according to the vast majority of people online, right, which is a good representation of societal norms, right? When you type in CEO, who comes up? I can tell you, because I've done this many times, and I would do this with you in front of the class if I were there, right? I can tell you, it's probably not going to surprise you that often what you'll see are older white men. When you think of a president, or when you type in president, who do you see, right? Some of you might say Trump, some of you might say Obama, some of you might say something entirely different, right? Maybe I should say Prime Minister too for others of you. But typically, across time and history, right, it's been white men, right? Minister, similar. But when we start to think about other jobs, like, and we talked about this when we were talking about gender, right? Like teacher or housekeeper, right? Those are often gendered roles as well. So I want us to think about why that is. Who's historically held positions of power and who has been represented in positions of power, right? Who is visible and understood as an authority, right? And who are the people that we see in more menial or caretaking positions and why, right? Some of us might say, well, that's just because I believe certain people are more authoritative or more responsible or more whatever the reason. I want you to think about. Right? Why is that you would put certain people in certain roles, and why in society, right, in our culture, do we automatically assume certain people belong in certain roles and others do not, right? Others do not. You'll see in the questions that I ask on the slide, right? Why is this the case? Have certain types of people historically held institutional power and others haven't? Why? Why not? Right? And we're going to talk about this a little more, or think about this a little more as we continue. I want you to head to the next slide. I want you to think about God, right? About what you see or what you think of when you hear the word God, right? So often, right, when I ask this question of students, they most often answer, they think of an old white man in the sky, right? Something akin to Santa Claus, really, right? And you'll see on the pictures that I've shown here, even in Michelangelo's depiction of God in the Sistine Chapel, it is an old white man with that, with a longer beard, who looks very powerful, right? Well, I want us to think about why, right? Why is that we imagine that God, that the representation of God in our imaginations would be an older white man? I mean, think about it. Often, and this is a result of colonization, those who have been the only ones who've had the opportunity to be in positions of authority have been, right, white men. Right? Think back, as many of our conversations, women were seen as property, right? Think back, consider slavery also, even in this past essay that we read for Margaret Amer, right? Traditionally, certain bodies have been deemed less than, right, subhuman for only certain positions, right, not as authoritative. And that has everything to do with our history across time, and we have to think about that. So we've even put God into this sort of equation, even factored God into this sort of equation, right? When you see certain types of people in positions of authority because they're the only ones allowed to take those positions of authority, automatically, right, we're going to see God, who is the ultimate authority, as similar to those who are already sort of in those positions. Mary Daly, in fact, said, if God is male, then male is God, right? There's a way in which then men have been seen as more authoritative, right? Because God was seen as male. We also talked about the fact that earlier in history, in fact, God was seen as female, not male originally, because of the woman having the power and capacity to give birth to life. Likewise, right, when you make God a white man, you make white man God, right? So there's a way in which once we sort of equate these two, then it's easy to see certain people as more authoritative than others, right? To see God as a white man. Why am I saying all this? Well, you look at these pictures, right? I Googled God, and that's what comes up, is white men, right? I mean, I grew up thinking that God was an old white man. Instead of seeing God as spirit, as we were wont to do, we want to put sort of a body or a face on abstract ideas or entities, right? So what about Jesus? What happens, and I want you to move to the next slide, what happens when we think about Jesus? Well, if you look at The Head of Christ by Warner Salmon in 1940, right? This is Warner Salmon and is depicting Jesus as people thought Jesus to be in 1940. Look at that Jesus. How would you describe him? Right? What are the words? And if we were together, I'd ask you, what are the words that come to mind, right? What do you think of when you think about this Jesus? When you look at that Jesus, right? And some of you, maybe serene, powerful, blessed, right? He's lit up, right? He's also white, right? He's got more dirty blonde hair. He's more perfect looking, right? All the words that you can think of to sort of describe him. Well, in 2001, Richard Nave decided to create, using the skulls of the bones of Palestinian men back in the first century when Jesus would have walked. He recreated CGI, right? He recreated what Jesus would have actually looked like. And this is what he looked like. And often what I ask, and what I would ask you to think about is, what do you feel and what do you think? How would you describe this Jesus, the Galilean man, right? What words come to mind? Do you feel like you trust him? Do you not? Why? Why not, right? If we put these two men side by side in the airport, for instance, you know I'm going to go there, you know I'm going to go there, which one would be more likely stopped by the TSA and frisked, right? Who would be detained and questioned, right? What happens, right? Is there a stereotype that we have when we look at the Jesus on the left versus the Jesus on the right? Some of you might say you feel more comfortable with the Jesus on the right because he looks more like an everyday common kind of fellow, right? Others of you might say he doesn't look as trustworthy. He also, I mean, even the way that picture is, right? He's in a mugshot, so maybe you would say, that too is having an influence on how you interpret him. But I want you to think about that, right? And then I want us to look at the next slide and to think about this. What is it that creates our prejudices around people? The way that we look at them, the way that we think about them, the way that we feel about them, right? So prejudice is a learned prejudgment, right? And I'm reading right off of this definition that I've given you. It's about members of social groups to which we don't belong. So it's based then often on limited knowledge or interactions with a particular group, right? And that leads us to sort of simplistic judgments and assumptions that are made and then projected onto that particular group, right? You can think right now, I'm sure, very quickly of things that you've heard your parents or friends say, your community say about members of another social group, ethnic group, racial, right, religious group, maybe even another gender, right? Prejudices that have been made out of limited knowledge or experience with particular groups of people, maybe even about their sexuality, right, or gender, maybe the comments made about trans people, for instance, that you've heard. So these prejudices, again, are based on limited experience or knowledge about these particular groups, right? I think about, too, Islamophobia. Often people are more Islamophobic when they don't actually have Muslim friends. So let's look at these other definitions that I've given you. Stereotypes, they're reduced or simplified characteristics that are attributed to a group, right? So you call that particular group lazy, or you may call that particular group dumb, right? Or less capable of taking responsibility. However, people may look at or stereotype particular groups. Discrimination then is action that is based on a prejudice toward those others, that group of others. So when we act on our prejudgments, then we are actually discriminating. So actions taken against those groups, whether they're words that are spoken or physical actions that are taken, graffiti, right? That's discrimination. Also, when we're hiring for jobs, right? There was a very famous, actually there's some research done about this, a study that was done on how people hire based on those hirees or applicants' names, right? Or the way that they talked. People's often prejudices lead to discrimination that they're not even aware of. So can you think of any examples in your own life, or even examples of times that you've experienced, go to the next slide, something called microaggressions possibly. So these are brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities. They could be intentional, they could also be unintentional. They communicate then sort of hostile or derogatory, maybe even negative racial slights, insults toward any marginalized or minoritized group, right? So these are things, again, intentional or unintentional, things that we say or do to discriminate against a group that is a perceived other, a minoritized or marginalized community, right? So what I've done then basically in the next slide is is sort of moving us to think about the way in which certain people get certain privilege due to structures of power that have been in place for years, right? So some people automatically are privileged simply because they're a part of a group that has had power historically. And others then don't have those same opportunities because they are a part of a group that has been disempowered or seen as other to the dominant class, the dominant group. So in this way then, prejudices can become systemic and they can become institutionalized, right? And that can lead to injustices, for instance, in school systems, right? Who has access to education, right? To better teachers, to better resources, books, right? To iPads, to computers, even to internet, right? Think about who and why. So what I've got next for you are some of the statistics, right? That I want you to take a look at. And I'm not necessarily going to walk through all of these, right? But I want you guys to take a look at these statistics to think about, for instance, so driving while Black or Latino. Black and Latino males are 3 times more likely than white males to have their cars stopped and searched for drugs, even though white males are 4.5 times more likely to actually have drugs on them when they're stopped, right? So this would be an example of institutionalized or systemic discrimination, right? Even though white men are 4.5 times more likely to actually have drugs on them, Black and Latino men are 3 times more likely than white men to be stopped, right? So I'll just let that sink in. So that's what skin tone, right? Someone's perceived race or ethnicity does. That's the effect that it has. For instance, this would be then racial profiling. So you guys can actually look at the rest of those statistics, and I'd really encourage you, right? I mean, just one more. Women make up 51% of the population, but prior to the 2018 midterm elections, only 17% of Congress was female. Only 17%, even though women are 51% of the population, right? So the stereotype then would be that women are not as authoritative or maybe as intelligent or capable of really making those kinds of important large-scale governmental decisions and representing their constituents, which is, it's heartbreaking, right? But what I'm getting you guys to think about, or wanting you to think about, is really maybe how these kind of stereotypes even influence you and how you look at people. So let's think about then Jesus, right? So here's Jesus in a situation where he's gone away to the region of Tyre, essentially for a getaway, right? This is a vacation that he's taking, right? And I want us to think about whether or not Jesus in this situation possibly was being prejudiced, which I think is what Valerie Bridgman wants us to grapple with, right? And so that's going to be the challenge. So Jesus then challenges the teacher of the law, asking him who his neighbor is, and uplifting the Good Samaritan who was looked down upon by Jews. Well, in this situation, and in your opinion, do you feel like Jesus is embodying his own teachings? Do you feel like he is discriminating potentially against this woman by calling her a dog, right? Again, we'll go over Bridgman's essay in the next video. But do you feel that he's discriminating? Or do you feel like Jesus already knew that he was going to help her anyway? He was just trying to test her faith, right? I mean, let's be honest. Calling someone a dog back then, and this is true, right? This is the way Jews did look down on Canaanites, same way they looked down on Samaritans, right? And calling someone a dog was a pejorative term. Absolutely, there's no doubt about it. And that's how Jews saw Canaanites at the time. So if we look at and think about the world behind, right, we've got to think about the fact that that is actually what's happening. Jesus is using a term that was used commonly for this group of people. They were seen as subhuman, right? And so that is a microaggression, absolutely. And he may have been doing it involuntarily, right, unintentionally, but he was doing it nonetheless because that is the way that he was culturally conditioned to see Samaritans, right? So this would be Bridgman's sort of argument. The question is, what do you think? Do you think that it's possible that Jesus did get schooled by this woman? That he had to learn from her to see all people, regardless of their cultural, racial, ethnic identity, as worthy of being a part of God's kingdom, right? A part of this community. So what I've done then is I've basically, in the next slides, I've given you Mark's version versus Matthew's version, right? What the woman actually says, right? I've given you some maps to see where Jesus was, right? And I want you to think about, right, the difference between Mark's version, which was written earlier, and Matthew's version, and the way that Jesus' response is different, right? So think about that, reflect on it, and compare it. I've also given you a slide as well to give you an idea of what how healing and demon possession was seen back then. As you'll notice, right, this was obviously before the scientific revolution, so there was no scientific explanation for certain things that happened, like convulsions. And so people often back then thought that it was the result of demon possession. And you'll see this word that is used in the text, epilambane, it actually means to seize or take hold of, to afflict or to possess. This is, so the English word epilepsy actually derives from this word. So the child was having a seizure, right? And now we would describe that as epilepsy, an epileptic seizure. Back then, they didn't understand that there was a connection. So to them, it was just about demon possession. It's the way that they were able to explain it. So what we'll do in the next video then is we'll think with Valerie Bridgman, go a little bit more deeply into what's actually happening here. What do you think about Bridgman's argument, right? Is she actually helping Jesus to become even better? All right, see you then.